The title of this panel is taken from two decisions, one in the Supreme Court of this country and one from the High Court of Australia, which is their Supreme Court. Our Supreme Court said that this patent should be granted because not to grant patents for this sort of invention, which I'll come to in a second, would have a chilling effect on innovation, not granting the patent. I'd held it invalid in the Court of Appeal. David Kitchen had held it invalid as being too far upstream. Nobody quite knew what the invention was for. They knew it would be useful for something, but you didn't really quite know what. In Australia, the myriad breast cancer gene patents were held invalid, and more so even than the United States Supreme Court, because they said you can't even have a patent for cDNA. And the reason, which they used, several of them said, was that if you had patents for something as basic and important as this, it would have a chilling effect on research. They stand in stark contrast one to the other. Annabel Bennett, Justice Bennett, came and gave the Hugh Laddie lecture last summer. She was hopping mad with the Australian High Court. They had reversed her, and she has left the court, but not because she's resigning in high dudgeon, but it enabled her to say what she thought. And I think it's a very serious question, one which has been addressed by a number of people, sometimes with evidence, sometimes without. The Australian High Court without. Our Supreme Court with a little bit of thin evidence, a letter from the biotech research body of some sort saying it would have a chilling effect if you didn't have a patent. This panel is an eclectic collection of people coming from very different backgrounds, and I'm very pleased to say that the first of the panel is John Howells, who did some research on famous examples of alleged technical hold-up caused by patents. And we're going to begin with John, and he's going to tell you a bit about it.
I'm going to tell you about 4 cases which are widely believed to be empirical illustrations of patent-induced development hold-up. There's a brochure which is available on the website, and if you've already seen it, it contains dozens of quotes from authorities in the patent professional field, academics, which illustrate this is a widely held belief in these cases. I'll show you some quotes in the slides. But essentially, my work with Ron Kuznelson is to show that they're untrue, all of them, for these 4 cases. But we call this the patent hold-up myth, because although the understanding varies depending on author and case, the essential belief is that the dispute and the difficulty in agreeing exchange of rights leads to development either not occurring or being held up entirely, so that there's the economic surplus available through development simply isn't being realized. So this is the belief, and apparently it's empirically demonstrated in these cases. So the conclusion actually is very simple. It's false in all cases, but it's a plausible interpretation when you are exposed to some of the data. I'm going to illustrate the kind of data we've collated to show that development, in fact, proceeded vigorously in all these cases. Because while the assertions are widespread, the data backing them up is not. So our job has really been to assemble that data, and you can download the papers from SSRN or the journals where they're published. In the radio case, many have described the high degree of litigation in suits before the cross-licensing agreement which created RCA in 1919 as a patent logjam or patent hold-up. But the center of that environment was a single court decision in 1916 where Marconi Company won an infringement suit against De Forest, who had a device in the marketplace based on the soon-to-be described as revolutionary triode technology, which has 3 electrodes rather than 2. So these are 2 sample quotes. Essentially, all the 4 leading academic US radio histories characterize the decision this way, that development, or manufacture in this case, simply stopped as a result of a court decision. We found data that showed this was not true, and essentially, this case, there is some production data for De Forest company. He went on manufacturing triode devices in the First World War, and mainly servicing government demand, and it rose after the decision. If you inspect the decision, you can see that one of the complications of the case is that the triode, the first commercial implementation, was for a radio frequency detector. There were many substitute technologies on the market, and vacuum tube technology was not the best. Crystal detectors were better. So it languished as a minor product. It wasn't very important. The court decision was restricted to De Forest's radio frequency device. It had no application to amplification or oscillation, which is what made continuous broadcast radio commercially viable. So it's a misinterpretation of the decision and a failure to recognize the different functions of the triode technology. Many hundreds of thousands were made during the war by many unlicensed manufacturers. We did something else. We plotted, the RCA archive has a set of vacuum tube patents, and we plotted them after dividing them into diode and triode inventions. And essentially you can see that the diode was a rather uninteresting device, rapidly exhausting exploitative opportunities, whereas the triode, there was a delay of sorts, and that was because although the patent has that its uses as an amplifier, De Forest never could show anyone it had a radical amplifier effect, not for years, until some years after it was granted. And it was then that the patenting rate picks up as many inventors crowd in to find out how to build new circuits and so on. And of course, the 1916 decision is in the middle of that trend. It has no effect at all upon inventive effort. There's no hold-up in this case. In aircraft, the general form of block we've got here is that you have a major field opened by a pioneer, and then an improver significantly improves on it downstream and independently. Their patents inside the claims of the upstream pioneer, and yet they can't practice it without licensing from the pioneer. So you find sometimes academics say, and they won't agree, it's a dangerous scenario. In this case, basically Heller, whose book on gridlock uses the patents often, is that the downstream improvement, they wouldn't agree, aircraft development was held up. Associated with that is the argument that the private parties having failed to reach agreement, the government had to intervene to create a cross-licensing agreement which facilitated renewed development. What we found is that the real pioneer of the downstream improvement was someone who's not recognized for having made it in the histories, because he never sought to assert his patent against any manufacturer. He conceived of the aileron as we know it today when you look out the aircraft window, had a patent, sold it to the US government for $100,000. The government promptly gave it away free to all manufacturers. There was no litigation, and there was no hold-up by definition. Everyone was using it by 1916, including Curtis, the main defendant against the Wright brothers. Everyone was using the Wright brothers' patents. They never succeeded in successfully enjoining, well, they never had, they never stopped anyone manufacturing with injunctions they were awarded on appeal. So there was no hold-up in this case. It simply didn't happen. We also plotted patents in this case, and you can see that as an indicator of development, there was an accelerating interest and rising rate of aviation patenting right up to the 1917 MAA cross-licensing agreement, which is alleged and commonly believed to have ended an impasse for which there's actually no evidence at all. However, in doing this, we did plot the Curtis company's patents. And the Curtis was the largest aircraft producer in the period up to the First World War in the States. And he was also the largest researcher and patentor. But his patency rate declines after he's entered the cross-licensing agreement. if you inspect the agreement, it's actually, it's not a patent pool. It's actually designed by the government. And it has two features of interest here. One is that anyone who supplies more than, I think the number's 25 aircraft to the government, automatically must join the pool. Oh, sorry, the cross-licensing agreement. And the second feature is that if you do join, all your patents become available to all other members of the pool. In other words, the government was compelling its suppliers to give their patents away free to all other members. This wasn't a private sector organised patent pool, so I must remember to call it a cross-licensing agreement. So we suspect that Curtis Company simply had no motivation to patent and develop after they were forced to join. And they were forced to join, as the Wright brothers' successor company was. So it's, we may have uncovered the reverse of what's alleged, that the removal of the patent incentive system led to a decrease in invention and development post-MAA cross-licensing agreement. Third case is the Edison invention. Here the allegation has changed. It's essentially that it's a misinterpretation that the invention itself covered carbon filaments and was basic to practice and manufacture of the incandescent lamp. It wasn't. But if you believe that, you find statements such as this in Department of Justice antitrust cases and patent academics saying it gave General Electric a monopoly over the field. As a result, they faced no competition. As a result, technical improvement dwindled away. They didn't need to develop. So that's the argument. It's incorrect. And in this case, the data, this is only one chart. It's a spectacular example of invention around Edison's claims. That was not, it wasn't a monopoly, economic monopoly granting patent. It had weaknesses. And essentially, what you see here in the red line is General Electric 16 candle power lamp price data. And when General Electric, the appeal court affirmed for the Edison patent, in its infringement case against the United States Electric Lamp Company, that General Electric spent 2 years enforcing the patent and driving out infringers from the field, and that's known. What's happened is that many have jumped to the conclusion that that meant they were building a monopoly. But no, they were simply driving people out of their field of technical control. Another chart would show you that non-infringing patents in the incandescent lamp class surged during the 2 years of this enforcement period. In other words, Edison didn't license this patent to anyone. So if you wanted to enter this field, you had to invent round. You had no other option. And many did so. And we've charted this. And some were successful in introducing new products. They did it in the enforcement period. And there's nothing that General Electric could do about it. So the blue diamond black dots show you much lower price, new entrants, non-infringing, basically introducing competition, which General Electric was busy trying to drive out, but couldn't. So we infer from this that they were forced to drop the price of their standard lamp. Paradoxically, during the period, they had won their court suits and were able to successfully drive out infringers, but unfortunately for them, not competitors. So essentially, if you check other data, the market share doesn't change this period. They won the suits, they drove out infringers, and they didn't increase market share. So there's no hold-up. Indeed, a surge of development around the claims is what they caused when they chose to enforce their patent. Automobiles, the infamous Selden patent was owned by the Association of Licensed Automobile Manufacturers. This is another type of allegation you come across, especially now. It was that they claimed that the entire automobile industry fell within the claims of this patent, and essentially everyone was an infringer who manufactured. But through the period, many others, including Henry Ford, claimed that it was actually so narrow that the claims were they construed the claims so narrowly it had no commercial value at all. So we would put this under the category that it was, you hear this argument, that uncertainty over overly broad patents of dubious validity creates uncertainty, a lack of investment, which drives away innovators, suppresses development. So it's that category, and some more specific claims is that why it didn't stop Ford, it slowed him down. In this case, this chart should dish that allegation. It's that we plotted the production of automobiles in the States versus Ford's production. They're exponentially increasing during the enforcement period. And it's in this period that Ford's major vigorous model development occurs. And he becomes the largest automobile producer in the United States, and he's outgrowing the average growth of the industry. So there's no question of him being slowed down. It simply isn't true. In fact, we've even got the cost of litigation in the 1903, which is probably his most vulnerable year, and it's smaller than his advertising budget. So when you've got all the data, it's preposterous, actually. And essentially, the story we've told in our paper is that Ford very early on was gathering data on the Selden patent to understand exactly what kind of a threat it would pose, and he very early on worked out it wasn't a threat, as did many others. So the ALAM's public pronouncements are simply a positioning device. It wasn't taken seriously by those in the field and in the know. Essentially, so this was a small sample of our data, but these cases which are commonly assumed to have illustrated development hold-up are no such thing. It's not true in any of the cases. We've been wondering how to consider other allegations. We've become more skeptical. I suppose it's inevitable from being immersed in this group of stories. So we'll take this line that when a cooperative surplus is understood to be available, should you develop the patents and the inventions, whatever the distribution of rights and however much they're disputed, development proceeds regardless. We'll assume that until it's proven not to be the case in some other case, that we've become skeptics of this theory. Those are the papers. You can read the works in full if you wish. Thank you.
We'll discuss later why people have developed these theories, which, if they had looked at the facts, they would have not developed. And I think it's a very big subject. And our next speaker is Nicholas Thum, who was the chief economist at the European Patent Office, which is where I met him. He left there, perhaps wisely. I couldn't possibly comment, to a more liberal regime, the European Commission.
My understanding of today's discussion is that actually in order to understand whether patents have a chilling effect on R&D, yes or no, we have to look into both sides. I think that's also under the scope of the discussion today. So they might have a negative impact, as was discussed right now, and in the cases was shown is not the case, or they might have a positive impact, which is the incentive argument, which is essential. However, if we miss the incentive argument and we can see, well, there is actually no incentive and there is no positive impact on R&D, then of course that would in itself also be a negative argument and would support the chilling effect argument. I would personally not agree with that, but I think in order to make such an assessment, we have to look into both sides actually. And that's where we're coming from, or where I'm coming from. So at the JRC, I'm not going into this in detail, but what is important here is just down there that actually it's about also stimulating innovation. So the research we're carrying out, after all, should help policymakers to stimulate innovation and come up with regulatory approaches, be it, for instance, in the case of patents, that help actually to improve the system, to make it better. And that's where my job is right now, and where my job was before, also with the European Patent Office. And before that, actually, also I was working at the Swiss IP Office, where my job was even more narrowly tied to this type of exercise, to find out empirical evidence that can either show that this or that regulation would help, or maybe not help, to make the patent system and other IP systems actually to work better. So, regulatory approach, and this is what I'm going to talk here today a little bit about. And I will go back to actually what it was all about when we look into history. Well, in the Venetian patent statute, it is already mentioned that this effect on R&D, that it's an essential part of the patent system, because it says there, of course, there is men of great genius, so these are the inventors. But actually, what should the patent system do? It should create actually, or incentivize more men that would then apply their genius and would discover and would build devices of great utility and benefit for our commonwealths. So that's very much the idea that was there from the very beginning. And of course, it is an essential part of what we call, and that's really the economic perspective, I would also try to come up here with what we call it a social contract, that is the patent system. So you get the exclusivity, but you have to give something for it, and that is actually the privacy of the information, which you have to actually to declare in the patent in the patent claims then. And this, of course, would also, and that's again that others can learn from it and improve upon it. This is again the incentive argument to make it so that others come and can actually use the patents and build then their R&D on it. Overall, and that I think is important, it is from a policy perspective, it is a balance. So you have to give, well, there's this market failure, we would argue, without patents, but then in the case when there is no incentive for R&D without patents, that's the argument we're talking about here. But very important, this is what I usually call here the second column of the patent system, is really that you have to reveal information, and that will then also be the basis for others to build their R&D and their research on. It's very important. We have actually very little research on this part here. This is striking somehow, the use of patent information and the benefit that derives from patent information. I think this is really a research branch that is definitely worth expanding more. And then from the policy perspective, and I think this is very important, that of course a patent is a patent is a patent. No, a patent is not a zero-one relationship. A patent system is not something, either you have patents or you don't have them. I mean, there's so many varieties in the legal systems that really make the difference. So that's really the regulatory approach then when you try to optimize the patent system and try to come up with specific regulations. So for instance, well, the question we're looking at here, so is there a limitation to research? Might there be this so-called anti-commons effect? Are there patent thickets? You might look into this. Is there things like royalty stacking? What effect has the quality of the examination process, for instance? Is there a need for something like a grace period? Do you need things like supplementary protection certificates? So move to longer protection over here. Is there an issue of, in a more narrow discussion when we look into patent enforcement? Just by the way, patent enforcement is a very essential part of this here, which makes the very difference. So it's not only just, again, have a patent or do not have a patent, but the way, of course, the patents are enforced. And the entire enforcement system really makes the very difference to how a patent will actually then have an impact on R&D, but also on the market in general. And of course, we have to go back somehow. What are the reasons why people apply for patents actually? And the main reason actually most people will tell you is freedom to operate. So keep others out of my garden. But then there's of course also the direct economic impact, and this is simply the return on investment, if you want so, from the patents when you license them out. And some of the patents are the cash cows in the patent portfolios, but it's actually very few. And this is a graph which we don't have to go into detail here, but what essentially shows is that out of a patent portfolio of big companies, and maybe this can be confirmed then later on, there is only about 10% of the patents in a portfolio actually make 90% of the value in terms of however you measure this, but also measured by a return on investment. So it's actually very few patents in the portfolio that really create some income, and that also are important for economic reasons. Then, of course, there's also many reasons for why to patent that can spur R&D, for instance, and a positive impact. So it really depends on why you apply for patents, and this is a scale from 1 to 5. 5 means these reasons are very important, but they're all important here in a way. So the commercial exploitation, licensing, cross-licensing to prevent imitation, blocking patents, so-called blocking patents, purely for reputational reasons, to prevent infringements use, purely defensive, whatever. But depending, of course, on which reason you apply for patents, they might have a different impact then on R&D. So it's very, very complex, the whole thing. That's what I want to say here. Same thing, of course, if you look into the different uses, how you actually share then your patents. Also, this has a very strong impact on R&D. So, be it a strategic use, be it commercial, be it strategic non-use as well. So, very different ways of doing this. And what I wanted to talk very briefly about here is about R&D. So, if we look at the top patent applicants at EPO from last year, and then actually I'm astonished here to see that there's, I would call them all, they're all R&D intensive, right? All these companies, they have their own R&D, so there must be somehow a relationship. However, it's very difficult to measure. I wanted to present here actually some material from work that we're carrying out at the institute where I'm working. This is the so-called the scoreboard, the R&D scoreboard, the European R&D scoreboard, and it's looking at the major R&D investing companies in Europe, and then it also looks into patents. But what you can see there, similar to this exercise, which is in a recently published report from the European Patent Office and the European Union Intellectual Property Office, as it is called now, formerly the Trademark Office in Alicante. And they try to build a relationship between employment and patent intensity. So they look into that's. I'm showing you this in order to illustrate how you can set up such kind of analysis. So you try to find out the industries where, by NAS classification there, where actually are many patents, and then you look either, as they do here, into employment or into R&D, and you try to figure out which are the industries. And what you can see here, of course, there's many very important industries that are quite, in this case, employment intensive. In the other case, they would be R&D intensive. And then you can make some assessments about overall, in this case, you can say that actually the so-called employment intensive, the patent intensive industries, sorry, they come up with almost 17% of the share of employment, direct and indirect effect. In the other case, it would be R&D as for the whole of Europe. Now, this, of course, and that's why I'm showing it, this type of analysis there is very short of causal relationship, because it's really the chicken and the egg problem. I mean, once you have employment, and once you have R&D, and then there's also patents, it doesn't necessarily mean that patents are the reason for the R&D or for the employment. So you have to be very cautious when you discuss these things. But of course, I think they are somehow an indication for something, at least, that these industries are definitely important, and that patenting in these industries is also important. So I think that's what we can conclude from this type of analysis. Now, otherwise, if we look into literature, there is quite some literature out there looking into patents and R&D and the empirical evidence, and already old literature back from the famous actually surveys from Mansfield already in the 80s, and really, but it's again, it's never been really clarified, this chicken and egg problem. What's there? Innovation, and then so you innovate and then you patent, or you have a patent and that brings you then into innovation. So it's really, it's very difficult. The problem, the specific problem that was addressed also in the previous presentation about this anti-commons effect of patents, I personally looked actually into this in the case of the biotech industry in Switzerland, also with a survey. It was a big report published in 2003 out there, and we couldn't find any of these negative effects, and what would postulate this so-called anti-commons effect. To the opposite, people like Stuart Graham and others, they can definitely confirm that in the case of biotech and pharma, patents are very important, but they're also much related to R&D. Not saying that they're the cause, but there's a clear relationship in this direction. When we discuss this, I think it's also very important to see what type of technology we have. When we discuss so-called software patents, of course, there's a big difference between Europe and the US. But there, for instance, for so-called software patents, this is a US study here, So Besson and Hunt find in their analysis that there is clearly very little relationship with R&D actually with these patents, but it's mainly about strategic motives. So again, but I think this is very much dependent on which industry we look into. What I said previously about biotech and pharma I think is quite solid. There the effects are more easy to observe, but then in other industries it's not so clear. Then also it's a matter of the size actually of the innovator, which is quite interesting. So there's the studies I'm mentioning here. So a recent report by the OECD, but also then this very old analysis from Grilliches and Hall back in the 80s. Actually, they show, we found that also in the case of the Swiss biotechnology industry, actually, that smaller entities, SMEs, relatively per less R&D produce more patents, or the other way around, however you want to look at this. So then big companies, so the big pharma, they still have many patents, but in comparison, the intensity is not so high as with smaller entities. So also there, it's quite interesting, and this is, of course, this discussion is important when you, in the context of venture capital and startup funding then for SMEs that want to build up new businesses. The whole thing, and this is, for instance, very interesting to look at in this book of Susan Scotchmer, that of course innovation or patents then create more innovation. That was the argument I tried to push a bit at the beginning about this effect of patent information. And in her book, actually, she makes quite some arguments that yes, that indeed what we typically call cumulative nature of innovation, so that it is standing on the shoulders of giants from Isaac Newton. So that once there is a basis, then actually there's about more to come. So, and it's nice to see that in some cases we can actually prove this. Now, in the case of patent thickets that have theoretically been claimed by Mr. Shapiro, and well, we discussed this. I think Robin, you've been there as well with the EPO advisory board, for instance, in 2012, and we couldn't find any of what we would call thickets. Well, or the thicket problem. There is thickets, for instance, but there is no, if you want to say so, a systematic problem. Thickets are rather what we could observe. We could observe in the analysis we did there, are rather a phenomena of a competitive industry. So there is a lot of competition as a consequence. There's many patents, and it's actually quite typically the mobile industry. It's actually quite a competitive industry with many patents, and actually also a quite successful industry. So the general argument would not be valid. Definitely not for the mobile tech industry that there is something like patent thickets that might have a negative impact on R&D. So, and now this is my last slide. The point I want to make here is that I think it actually, in order to make a complete analysis, you know, we're discussing here today the chilling effect on R&D of patents, but if you want to do something like I would call it a patent system welfare analysis from an economic point of view, this would comprise many things, and it's probably totally out of space, definitely out of space of the discussion here, and it's rather difficult to come up with, but I'm just mentioning a few elements that probably would have to be considered there. So it's the R&D chilling effect, positive, negative, whatever. So then the patent information spillovers, very difficult to grasp, startup support of patents, the licensing revenue in itself, the patent thickets I mentioned already, the general market distortion. Again, patents per definition are a limitation of competition. It's difficult to actually measure that effect. New players in the field, the famous patent trolls, we couldn't find, at least for the time being, not a serious problem in Europe with our recent report that we published a few weeks ago. Then, in a more narrow definition, the patent hold up, patent hold up, patent hold out. As for so-called front licensing, for instance, this is then more on the licensing on the outside. And then, of course, there's an important thing I wanted to add, actually. That's why it's on the slide, what I call the, the political economy of the patent system. I mean, it's been so long around, and so it's difficult to think it away. But there's, of course, a lot of vested interest in the whole patent business. I mean, there's all the actors, and so is, of course, on the company side. But then there's the patent attorneys, and I can tell you interesting stories, for instance, about why patent attorneys in Spain generally, why they claim that of course the Spanish language is so important. So that's the reason why they're not joining the European the unitary patent. But there is another clearly economic reason behind that, and it's really about the patent attorney business in this case. So there's a lot of vested interest in this whole business, and I think it's about time also that maybe from a political economy point of view somebody might look into that. And there's a lot more, of course, I might have definitely forgotten. So with this, thank you very much.
Now Ken is much more specialist, and he's been looking at the effect of pharma patents around the world, and particularly in undeveloped countries.
I'm a bit of a fish out of water because I'm actually not talking about innovation per se, but some broader issues around what we can call, for lack of a better phrase, the globalization of pharmaceutical patenting. And all my comments are going to be about this area of drugs, the area of patenting in drugs. So what this is the years in which countries made patent products on pharmaceuticals patentable. And each is a 5-year period, and the bar is the number of countries in that time period, in that 5-year period. So what you can see is in the 1970s and 80s, it starts picking up in Western Europe. The other thing that you don't see on this graph is that in the 1970s, many developing countries stopped granting pharmaceutical patents. And then everything picks up in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And this is a story that we know about, the story of the World Trade Organization and TRIPS. A couple of caveats before moving on. This is not comprehensive. This is only 55 countries that I was able to collect data on about the year that they made pharmaceutical products patentable. But I will say that all of the countries that I'm missing are all in this area. In other words, there's not a single country that adopted patents prior to the 1990s that I don't have the data on. It's all of the action. If the difference between this graph and what the full population of the world looks like is that what you see here would be accentuated if we had all of them. Okay. So this is the context. I think it's a familiar context, but it's worth starting with that. This next slide sort of links in many ways with Nicholas's final slide. Now we could spend the whole lecture on the first part of this slide, which I'm not going to. These are sort of the well-known potential benefits that having a patent system is thought to bring, and also well-known potential costs that having a patent system is thought to bring. And I think that everybody, well, most people, agree that there are benefits, potential benefits, and potential costs. It's not necessarily an all-win or an all-lose situation. What I want to emphasize is the stuff that I shaded at the bottom, which is a simple way of thinking about this. This is why I titled this sort of benefits and costs, a development perspective. I think, simply speaking, if you expect that the benefits in your country are going to be greater than the costs, then you're going to allow patents, pharmaceuticals to be patentable. And if you expect that the benefits of doing so are going to be less than the cost, then you don't. Seems pretty simple. Now, the only point that I want to add to this is that I think that the abilities in the world to harness the benefits, to make these things not just potential but real, and to mitigate the costs, to make these things diminish in their effect, the abilities to do that are not distributed evenly around the world. Okay. Basically, quite simply, prior to this period, if left to their own choices, most only wealthier countries would choose to grant patents because the benefits in their country is greater than the cost. Now, this is the same 55 countries. What I've done now is I've plotted them, the year that each one did it, and on the left-hand, on the vertical axis is the per capita GDP of the country using the same year, so that the years are, so it's comparable, right? And of course, if you're the US or the UK or Switzerland or Germany, the benefits are probably clearly greater than the cost, so you do it fairly early. But even if you're not the US, UK, Switzerland, or Germany, the benefits at some point become greater than the cost, and you might eventually do it. And if you're not, where the benefits are less than the cost, you wait, and you essentially wait until you're compelled to do it, which again is what this area is here of poorer countries that started introducing drug patents in the 1990s. And again, to repeat what I said a moment ago, there's lots of dots that are missing because this is only 55 countries, but all of the missing dots are basically here. Okay. Now, as we know, the countries in this circle here resisted this tooth and nail, and they lost. What are the effects of the spread of pharmaceutical patenting? Like, what has happened now? We have about 20, 25 years of this. What has happened? Well, in many ways, in the most simple way of putting it, it's just frankly too early to tell. Now, that might raise some eyebrows. How could it be too early to tell? This has been going on since the early 1990s, really after 1995, which is when the TRIPS agreement comes into effect. And here it's important to sort of remember a very, very important detail of the TRIPS agreement, which is the international agreement that obligated countries to grant pharmaceutical patents when they weren't doing so otherwise. And that is that it's not retroactive. Countries were expected to start acknowledging applications filed from 1995 onwards. But they weren't expected to do anything with applications that were filed prior to 1995. And those of you who are familiar with the pharmaceutical industry will be aware of the long lag time. The drug that was put on the market in 1998, the drug that was put on the market in 2000, the drug that was put on the market in 2005 probably still relied on a patent that would have originally been filed prior to 1995. So because of that, most of the effects take a long time to be felt. The following slide illustrates that. This is what we did here. I did this with a co-author at Columbia University in the US. We took every drug that had been launched, approved for launch by the US FDA from 1995 onwards. And for each one, we identified its first patent, its first US patent. Its first US patent, the first patent is generally speaking expected to be the strongest patent, the most important patent, the patent on the compound. And we found the date of its first patent. Now, the action here is all, and this dotted line is 1995, because I'm trying to illustrate the importance of this. The action here is, and the size of the dot, sorry, is the number of patents. So for example, this is suggesting that, in 2000, there were a number of drugs. In 2000, there were a fair number of drugs that were issued where the first patent was dated, it looks like, from 1988 or so. One thing that this suggests then is that even after TRIPS came into effect, even after that sort of the right hand of my graph started, most new drugs continue to rely on older patents that, as if nothing had changed yet. This presents the same data in a different way. This is for every year the fraction of drugs that were launched in every year from 1995 on that have where the first patent is after 1995. So it could be affected by this global change that we're experiencing. And here, again, it's very slow. It's very slow. We don't even cross the 50% until 2006 or 2007. Even as recently as a couple of years ago, 2013, which is when this data is finished, it's still only about 3/4 or 80% of the drugs. Lots of drugs are still relying on earlier patents as if this big change hadn't taken place yet. So in some ways, it's just still too early to tell. Now, this is all focusing on the first patent. Drugs, as we know, have more than one patent. They have multiple patents. They might have the first patent that we can call sort of the primary patent, which is what all of these data are about. But you also might go and take out a patent on an alternative form of it, an alternative form of the molecule, a formulation, a use of it. And most drugs have multiple patents on them. Okay, we're not talking about cell phone type of patents. We're not talking about the thousands, but we're talking in the multiples. And this is the distinction that many of us make between what we're calling, for quite basically, a primary patent, which is the first patent, the patent on the compound, and the secondary patents, the ones that come after. People care about secondary patents. They care about secondary patents for the reason that I put on the slide in italics, right? That patents will be filed sequentially. They're all going to expire, if granted, 20 years from the date of application. So if you can get multiple patents filed sequentially on existing molecules and drugs, it could potentially, combined with other actions, particularly in the area of marketing, it could potentially extend periods of market exclusivity. Some people in the crowd love it. Some people in the crowd hate it. Right? If you love it, you call it pharmaceutical life cycle management, and if you hate it, you call it evergreening. But we're all talking about the same thing. If I extract a definition of pharmaceutical life cycle management from here, and I extract a definition of evergreening from here, the nouns and the verbs are exactly the same. The only thing that's different are the adjectives and the adverbs. Trivial, nasty, unnecessary, worthy, so. But what the actual who's doing what to whom, there's no change. Now, this is a concern. Health authorities around the world are concerned about the proliferation of secondary patents. In the US, the response is basically to grant them, we think, and then allow market actors to fight it out towards the end via litigation. So whether it should have really been granted or not becomes decided by judges later down the line, well after the point of examination itself. I should just add, I should have added a few moments ago on that slide, is that most people think that in general, all else being equal, primary patents are legally going to be stronger than secondary patents. That's not to say that all primary patents, when challenged, will always be upheld. And that's not to say that all secondary patents, when challenged, will always be invalidated. But all else being equal, the first patent is more likely to be new, and it's more likely to be able to demonstrate an inventive step than the things that follow afterwards. Developing countries have typically tried to address this via examination. So in my research, I've looked in particular at 3 countries that have put into place specific approaches to deal specifically with secondary patents. They're not trying to not grant primary patents. They would have liked to not grant primary patents. They fought against the TRIPS agreement, but they lost. That fight's over. So now they're basically dealing with secondary patents. I won't spend too much time on this slide because I'm weary of time. But just, there's 3 countries here that were looked at. Each one I also gave in parentheses the date in which pharmaceutical products became patentable. The Indian one is the most is the most detailed. It's a provision in the patent law that essentially says we don't grant secondary patents unless they demonstrate increased efficacy. The Brazilian one is the hardest one to decipher because the Brazilian one doesn't say anything about secondary patents. It's, as I say here, completely de facto. But what happened is that the Brazilians have a dual examination system. To have your patent be granted in Brazil, it has to be approved by the Patent Office, but it also has to be approved by an agency within the Ministry of Health. That's Anvisa. And the agency within the Ministry of Health doesn't like secondary patents. So to get through both of the hoops, it's harder to get the secondary patents through both hoops. So we think. Or we'll come back to that in a sec. And the Argentinian system is the most sort of hodgepodge-ish, because a while ago, soon after making pharmaceutical products patentable in Argentina, they said second uses couldn't get patents. And then more recently, in 2012, they introduced a very restrictive set of guidelines, essentially modeled, for those of you who are familiar with it, essentially modeled after the guidelines that Carlos Correa wrote for the World Health Organization in 2007. This is all done through instructions from the Patent Office to the examiners. There's nothing in the law about any of this. So we wanted to see, do these things matter? We looked at every patent application that was filed through the PCT in a 3-year period at the beginning of the decade. We coded each one. Is it primary or is it secondary? We haven't found the national versions of these where they exist. They're not all filed in all countries. And we looked at the outcomes. And we did it for these 3 countries and also the 3 major sort of trilateral patent offices. And this is just the outcomes in general in the broadest sense. In the paper that I cite here, we go into a lot more detail. But this just looks at it in general. The light bar in each is primary, the dark bar is secondary, and these are grant rates. And so, what you could see is, I could talk about this slide for the next 40 minutes. I won't. I want to say what I think one of the takeaway from this slide is that these measures to address secondary patents are don't seem to be very effective. Countries that have specific measures on the books to address secondary patents, you would think that their secondary rate, the difference between the primary rate and the secondary rate would be greater in those countries than in the countries that don't have those measures. You don't see that. In fact, the only country that seems like it has any noticeable difference is the US. I think the upshot is it's really hard to evaluate patents. I'm going to skip over this next one and just go to my conclusion. This is just about why secondary patents, the difference that might matter over time. We can come back to that in the Q&A. Let me just wrap up with sort of 3 final points, and then I'll turn it over. First is just to underscore that, again, we're still in a period of transition. It's too early to tell is always an unsatisfactory answer, but it's too early to tell. We're in a transition. Second thing is question, do we really need, I'm sort of slipping to the third bullet point here. It's not entirely clear here that patents in developing countries really matter for the things that we're talking about tonight, innovation. I don't think that patents in developing countries are an incentive for innovation. I'm not sure that patents in developing countries are a disincentive for innovation, and it's not entirely clear to me that the absence of patents in developing countries would be a disincentive for innovation either. That doesn't mean that they're an irrelevance, however, and this gets back to my point about benefits and costs. Even if they don't produce very many benefits, they still might produce costs. You have to look at both sides of the ledger. And so far, what the last 30 years has been all about, and here's my final point, has been all about getting countries to grant patents, without any effort to help countries develop what you could call sort of the complementary capabilities to harness the benefits or mitigate the cost. Whether that's to improve the R&D infrastructure, to improve the judicial systems, to improve regulatory capabilities, any of the things that might be needed to make the patent system, the supposed incentive effects of the patent system actually have an incentive effect, that's your problem to take care of. Just set up the patent office. And any of the things that might basically allow countries to have a greater ability to mitigate the cost, again, that's your problem to take care of. Just all we care about, we mean the international community, is that you set up the patent system. And to me, as someone who teaches and works in the Department of International Development, this actually strikes me as a huge asymmetry or a huge gap in global governance. And that basically all of the effort is on creating the patent system, and none of the effort, or very little of the effort, is basically on helping countries overcome this huge asymmetry that's out there in how to use the patent system. Sorry if I went over. Thank you very much.
David Rosenberg got off an aeroplane today and is staying up specially to talk to you. If he falls asleep in the middle of it, we'll wake him.
Yeah. Working? Yes. I'm going to be very brief. A, because I don't have much to say, and B, because I am quite tired and I need a drink. You'll be surprised that coming from the pharmaceutical industry, I think patents are vital for innovation. And you'll be equally surprised to hear, or you won't be surprised to hear, that I don't think they significantly inhibit innovation. Can I just ask a question? Does anybody in this room think patents significantly inhibit innovation? One person. You should be up here then. Because good for Q&A. In that case, I'll just be very, very brief, because I don't really have to defend against many people, which, believe me, being on the patent side in the pharmaceutical industry is a rarity. I'll just make 2 points for the moment, because I think Q&A generally is going to be more important, especially with one of our questioners, and it was only one. Since the mid to late 20th century, we've probably seen more innovation in more technological sectors than ever before, and we've also seen more patents. I think it's also true to say, and I have no data for this at all, okay, it's instinct. I do policy. I'm a lawyer, but I do policy, and policy, whatever policymakers tell you is based on evidence. It's rubbish. It's based on instinct and political attractiveness. Sorry, Nicholas. But in those areas where you have seen the most patents over the last 50 years, or 20 years probably, which are probably the tech sector and the pharma sector, you've probably seen the most innovation. Now, for me, it is entirely counterintuitive to say the patents are inhibiting innovation. That does not mean that these patents are all good patents and every single one of these patents promotes innovation. But it just seems to me, I mean, never mind that you've proved historically that the allegation is false, it just seems to me so utterly, utterly unreasonable, subject to what I'm about to hear, that in our sector patents inhibit innovation, that I really don't understand the argument. It's one of these myths that's become reality that's led to Brexit and has led to President Trump.
Post-truth.
Post-truth, yes. The second point, and it's a point I think Nicholas was alluding to, and I really don't understand economics, but you use the phrase counterfactual, I think, a lot in competition or things.
Yeah.
If we didn't have this patent system, what would happen? Would we have seen the innovation in the first place that is now being inhibited by patents? And I think the point you were raising, Nicholas, and also I think the point you were getting at, Ken, is it's not that black and white. I can think of a few people who say get rid of the patent system and everything will be fine. I don't think that's generally the question. I think it's where are the limits? Where should the limits be to draw that balance between cost and benefit? And I think I would agree with you, Ken, and I just hope I'm not quoted, that may vary between the development status of a country. Many people in our industry say the stronger the patents in any country, the better it will be for that country. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that. I think it is certainly arguable. But the counterfactual, I don't think, should be if there were no patents, would we get any innovation? Because I think the answer is probably quite clearly not. I mean, in our sector, you can do without patents. You just have an exclusivity system based on, at the moment, regulatory data protection. It's not the patent itself that is key, it is its impact. It's the exclusivity that allows you to recoup successful and unsuccessful. So really, I mean, as I say, only two things to say. One, for me, it's absolutely clear that patents do not inhibit innovation to any significant degree because we see so much innovation and so much patenting. And two, what's the alternative, really? What is the counterfactual? Is it time for a drink?
No. First of all, I'm going to tell a couple of stories over my career. My last case as a barrister was the hepatitis C virus, which had been searched for 10 years. Some people were beginning to think there wasn't such one, but they knew there was hepatitis passed by blood transfusion, which had been tested for the known hepatitis, A and B, and people were still getting hepatitis. The patent was extremely broad. In effect, it covered anything you wanted to do with hepatitis C. It covered the protein and the nucleotide sequence. What happened? Did the Chiron company, which in due course got taken over, become the wicked monopolists of everything to do with hepatitis C? Did all research stop? Quite the contrary. Everybody started researching hepatitis C. So the patent, the big broad patent, did not inhibit research. Nobody's yet found a vaccine, but they've begun to find some cures, which is rather spectacular. Second example is, it's a twofold example really. The HGS case, that's the case where the patent was upheld by the Supreme Court, involved a fight between, in effect, GSK, his lot, and Eli Lilly. Eli Lilly were developing a different product from GSK. They knew the patent was there and around the world, but they still carried on developing their product. They finally lost the legal case. Almost certainly the result would have been a settlement because they were producing the product for a different indication from GSK's product. But in fact, their product failed in phase 3. It must have cost them Lord knows how much. But one can see a huge drug company deciding to go ahead and do research, notwithstanding there's a patent out there, which they might fail to knock out, and indeed did fail to knock out. And perhaps the last example was happened last year when you saw Bristol Myers, BMS, and Ono is the name of the patentee, suing Merck, hugely wide patent claim, the use of DP1 for the manufacture of medicine for the treatment of cancer. And Mr. Justice Burse has held it valid for that wide claim. Interesting. BMS did not ask for an injunction. They've reserved the right to do it, But basically what they're saying is, come on, Merck, pay your share. So, those who want to comment or ask questions, please have a go now.
Just to say, a lot of the speakers and data has been about large companies, and I wonder whether there's a chilling effect on small companies who are too afraid to litigate, who are too afraid of freedom to operate. I've been in many meetings where investors have been afraid of investing in a company due to lack of freedom to operate. So I think, for example, early stage biotech, we're not seeing, or we're seeing that sector is very afraid of lack of freedom to operate. They cannot litigate. And when we, so I think the question is different for small companies, and I would just say for the evidence that patent thickets don't have an effect, but how can we tell the lack of existence of companies that did not come into being because of patent thickets? How can that be accurately measured? So I think some of the research perhaps is not identifying the negative, all the research that didn't happen in the companies that weren't formed, especially the small companies. So a lot of the positive data, I'm sure, is correct, but perhaps does not apply to small companies in early stage research.
Who would like to comment on that? Nicholas, can you? Small companies we can't measure, and maybe they're all being put off.
I made the point that I mean, there's quite some research out there, not on what you're asking the question again is about the counterfactual. I mean, or the companies that you don't see because they haven't actually invested, they did not receive any investment because they did not dare to do so because they had no freedom to operate because of patents. Well, I'm not aware of any research on that specifically because it's simply difficult to grasp. I mean, how you want to measure something that, you know, again, the counterfactual is really difficult to get there. But to the opposite, and that was the point I tried to make, I mean, there's quite some, in particular for SMEs, a lot of research there, and in particular for pharma and biotech, that patents are extremely important to start up. I mean, to get funding, you know, if you go to a venture capitalist, to a business angel, whatsoever, I mean, to get funding, I mean, the essential item you can present and they want to see is a patent. Which I criticized usually, is they typically don't look into what the patent is about, nor can they evaluate the quality, nor whatsoever. But if you have a patent, that's great. Okay, so, and that will definitely, you know, make your point when you ask for money. And so there's quite some research on that, and the effect there is positive. So I know if somebody else want to comment on that. Yeah, and the second point again is the general issue of counterfactual. So I mean, it's very difficult to measure, and you know, we're going back to. I mean, it's been mentioned before. I wanted to read it out. Actually, this was two famous economists back in the 50s. They had this. What is the quote here? If we did not have a patent system, it would be irresponsible on the basis of our present knowledge of its economic consequences to recommend instituting one. Okay? But since we have had a patent system for so long time, it would be irresponsible on the basis of our present knowledge to recommend abolishing it.
Any of the patent professionals here who have had small clients have found themselves deterred from doing research or anything that anybody's got practical experience of real cases, I'm asking. Anybody? Yeah, you're the only one. We've got quite a lot of professionals here. Right. Tell us about it as best you can without disclosing any confidential information.
So a very early stage company, biotech, have a range of patents and patent applications, and they had a relationship with a company that went bust, and they're looking at a workaround of a method patent, which is important for them because it's how they manufacture one of their prime products that they also have patent applications directed to. And at the moment, we're trying to see what the infringement risk is, basically. So they had their own portfolio, they want to proceed, they want to manufacture, but they know these patents are out there, they're pending in Europe, they're granted in the US, and they're looking into it. And if they do find there's an infringement risk, they'll have to take a decision on whether to proceed or not. But they're more savvy about it. It's not a full stop, but it's something they're looking into. And they have their own protection as well. So it's standard sort of happening. But they're a very small company.
not convinced myself that you've yet got a case of hold-up.
Yeah, it's not a hold-up really, but it's a it's
or
a complication.
Or indeed even of holding back.
No, I would
research.
say it's just an aspect of business that they know exists.
Oh yeah, obviously you've got to be careful not to like infringe other people's patents.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, you've got an example. Hang on, you better have the mic's coming to you now. I don't need this mic, do I?
It's a university client, and
Sorry?
it's a university client. So basically, it's university research. They've identified a patent that covers certain types of making plants, and the entire sort of whether or not to set up a new institute at this university is being put into question, and then that institute is planning to spin out companies, and all of that has now been sort of called into question. So it's the fact that obviously you can engineer around, and obviously you can approach them and try and get a license and so on, but I've been very much witness to the way the academics are responding to the existence of a patent on what they consider to be very normal research tools, basically.
It's going to sound awfully patronising, and it's not supposed to. Firstly, I don't know when this patent was granted or applied for, obviously. It might be ordinary research now, but at the time it was applied for, it could have been highly inventive. So that's point number one, as you well know. But I just wonder, I mean, I think there is a concern. I've heard it expressed by others about academics. Have they tried approaching the patentee? I mean, isn't that... Step number one, is there a patent? Step number two, do you think it's valid and invalid or invalid? And I recognise all the uncertainties and costs around that. And it's particularly horrible if it's a patent application, which frankly is a real problem because we have European Patent Office is slow, particularly in the opposition process and appeal process. But I think in most cases, certainly if it's only an academic, if it's not going to be a commercial rival at present, approach the patentee and I'll make you, there's a reasonable chance you'll get a deal done.
Just to answer, basically...
You might have found an unreasonable patentee not to access this client.
Yeah, so basically a lot of the universities, UK universities that have come late into tech transfer are not very sophisticated. And so part of the problem here is that they're not patent savvy enough to have a strategy of what to do next. So that's, you could say that's their fault rather than the patent system. But what we see is that a certain level of savviness is now needed in order to approach the problem. So you're forcing an academic institution to get into patent lawyers, to sort of, get expert advice and so on.
Yeah, this is rotten. They're trying to have it both ways. If they just want to do academic research, patents can't get, doesn't matter what the patent says, because there's a research exemption. So far, so good. If they want to do academic research and then spin out and make money out of it, well, they've got to start thinking like people in business. Otherwise, they're just trying to have it both ways. They're like Boris.
What we're talking about is, and the reason why I think this is important, is it's a UK university. So it's basically a university department, an important university department, not knowing what they found a patent, they don't know what to do next. Apparently a lot of academics are now sort of facing a lot of uncertainty due to this. So the question, I mean, if coming back to the original, is there a chilling effect, then at this university there is a chilling effect. So,
well, so basically what it boils down to, if you're ignorant and unsavvy, then anything to do with patents might frighten you. Well, I suppose it might. I mean, that's got to be a very low level of frightening.
Just to repeat what Sir Robin said, I mean, there is a research exemption out there, so which allows you to do research on any invention that is out there, and then you can actually use the information that is in the patent system. I think this is very important to keep in mind. There is, so to be clear, I mean, research exemptions, they differ from legislation to legislation. So there might be sneaky little differences, and they're broader or narrower in, I don't know about the UK, but definitely the UK research exemption is different from the German, from the Italian one, and so on.
Even the narrowest would cover a university just doing research.
Yes, I mean, and no company, just by the way, would like to see itself in the press, actually suing a university, just to be clear. But it's more tricky, of course, when it's about research tools, because by using research tools for research, of course, you use them. And there it's more tricky. So that's I think we have to maybe, I don't know, Dave, you want to say a few words?
I certainly don't want to get into the research tool thing, because I just don't think there's time this year. But I do think there are, I would not regard this as an inherent problem in the patent system, but I think there are issues about how different sectors of society, their understanding of the patent system, their understanding of the real world out there. I mean, I suspect this wouldn't happen in the United States because they have phenomenally sophisticated tech transfer offices who usually overvalue their inventions hugely. They play the game that you're scared of, the big company playing the game. But I accept if the simple question is, are there any chilling effects? This is, but I would say that's not inherent in the patent system. I think it's a deeper societal knowledge issue.
Now, are you going to tell us why you think it's happening? Okay, the mic's coming to you now.
So having said that I think patents have a chilling effect, I actually think they can have a chilling effect, and in their current state they do. So one of the things that we've been talking about is looking at historical and time series analysis of what's happened over the last, century. And the problem is, and as has been discussed with the counterfactuals, we can't really answer this question, and I don't know that we ever will be able to, because sales data only tells you what the sales are versus what they could have been. And same thing with patents, because patents aren't a measure of innovation. So I'm very sympathetic to Nicholas's balancing scales, because I think that's the crux of the question here, and that is the balance right? And I don't think it is at the moment, which is why I think they do having a chilling effect, because we're seeing expansion of IP rights across the world, and even in jurisdictions where they're already well established.
No, we're not.
Copyrights being extended.
Come on now. This is a patent session. Yeah. Copyright and trademarks, I quite agree, have gone out of hand.
Yeah, there's a general
patents have been pulled back. The United States Supreme Court, Australian High Court, United Nations high-level panel. Whichever way you look, there's somebody saying, here, we ought to knock patents down. The European Commission Competition Authority, whichever way you look, people are knocking patents more and more. Now, we're not quite 19th century abolitionists. Some people argued in the 19th century for abolition of the patent system altogether. It happened in Holland for 30 years. Weak patent system, or no patent system. It was weak in Germany to some extent until they strengthened it. Whichever way you look, at the moment there are abolitionists, dark clouds gathering over the patent system.
And
you are one of them, without a single example of hold-up that you can talk about.
I think actually it could be that in the jurisdictions you're talking about, and specifically I can appreciate that. But I think also from a policy perspective, we could be seeing that some of that is actually shifting to trade secrets. So trade secrets are expanding across the world, in particular US and the EU having recent trade secrets directives, and the EEA being extended in the US. So perhaps it's happening sneakily that they are being expanded as a complement.
But how's that chilling innovation? Yeah. I mean, you started up, sorry.
Yes, so how's that chilling innovation? Because it's eating up the commons. So the more we eat up the commons...
How does trade... Well, if you...
Sorry, perhaps that was a slightly sideways comment. So trade secrets can be a complement to patents, and therefore if you're able to expand your trade secrets protection, perhaps you're able to bolster your patents at the same time.
Well, a counterbalancing argument, and I have no evidence for it, is that if you get rid of this patent system, which I assume you're not actually saying get rid of it, but there will be less disclosure,
yes.
More will be held confidential, and therefore there won't be a commons to anti-commons. So how does that help?
Indeed. And so which is why I think it's interesting that we are seeing expansion of trade secrets, because it has that flip side to it. I think.
Do you know that?
Yeah.
You've made an assertion about an expansion of trade secrets.
Yes.
I don't believe it. I know we've got some legislation about it.
It's being increasingly criminalized.
But I don't believe that the legislation protects people taking away trade secrets. But by and large, most countries have had legislation to that effect one way or another anyway.
So it's being both harmonized and expanded. So it's being increasingly criminalized.
And is anybody doing anything different in industry as a result of these changes to the law? Because I don't believe they are.
I think that's too early to say. Good caveat.
I mean, companies can't protect certain things by trade secrets because you have to sell them. And you can figure out what they are by reverse engineering. Most things you sell are like that.
I'd like to ask you what you mean by eating up the commons. How does patent law encourage that? Do you believe in an anti-commons, at the head of an iceberg?
So I'm perhaps taking a very holistic view of IP in the commons, and I am aware that this is a patents forum. Well, yes, I mean, it's that idea of patent thickets, it's the idea of broader patents and not being able to invent around them. And again, it's a balance question. I'm not saying that patents always do this, but I'm saying that the current system is likely to have these chilling effects. But again, the frustrating thing is we cannot answer these questions. We can only debate them.
I would add one thing to this. Can I put in a more here? There's a number of words you're using. Some of these words are, I tried to trace the origin of them. The patent thicket's an interesting one. Egan and Teese wrote an article on its origin in the 80s and how it flourished. It's now impossible to talk without using it or trading discussion using it. But it's imprecise, it's a metaphor, that's all it is. It's pejorative, it tilts the game against patents, thorns being written. There's no basis for that. And so our language has been, we're forced to use it, and yet, I was going to mention this point before, what is a thicket really? It's going to be difficult to describe it technically and accurately. If you look at, an earlier speaker raised the idea that, well, they keep people out. And then you have to ask, well, you've got a patent that excludes others. You think they should have the ability to come into the patented area without doing anything. Is that right? They probably wouldn't argue that if it was one patent, but when it's a thicket, it seems to be a problem. And I would say, if you look at the agreements in patent pools and cross-licensing agreements, which are often at the heart of alleged thickets, there are often clauses which allow innovators outside the thicket to enter the thicket. They get access to the technology, the patented technology inside the pool if they can contribute to it. So your ticket of entry is that you are an innovator, but you don't get something for nothing. And in that sense, thickets can be understood in the normal terms we use, and they're not a problem, basically.
You're quite right, it is a pejorative term. And it's interesting because if you think about the way that we talk about the commons, there's two ways of looking at it, which also can be quite pejorative or not. So IP taking information out of the commons, whereas eventually it is supposed to contribute to it. And that too is something that, in terms of the way we talk about IP and knowledge, is something that I think often forgets, that IP takes out of the commons.
So that's the other difference I have with you. I mean, I understood the patent system, you have to meet novel and obvious criteria.
Yeah.
So there wasn't a commons before something got patented, and eventually it goes into the commons when the patent expires. So the patent system is a way of creating new knowledge which eventually ends in the domain. The reverse idea is more popular and more discussed, but I can't see any basis for it.
Again, it goes to that balance. But I've always found that the way we talk about the commons has certain connotations to it also, often negative.
Okay, one more go, and then it's Drinky's time. Then David can have one.
It's another GSK person.
Oh, I know. It's only because I love GSK. I've even considered some of their cases in court.
Yes, I know that, Robin.
And he's still sore about it.
Thank you.
You've got a mic?
Sorry.
Mic over there.
Okay, I have a very, very quick comment. I've been a patent attorney for 30 years. Maybe I'm not a very good one, but I've never managed to create a thicket.
All All right, I think we can't better that, so we're going to stop.
Yeah. I was just, my question is, like, we've looked at some of the historical data and how the sort of, we looked at how the patents existing did not affect the certain industries, and it debunked some of the ideas which were prevalent in the literature. But I was just thinking about looking at the UK's own experience in 1919, when the product patents for pharmaceutical and chemicals were actually abolished and only process patents were introduced, and that was all to do with to protect the UK industry from the German industrial strength. I was just thinking, how would that reconcile to the point we are making? Well, actually points, the patents do not have chilling effect, because that was a very clear-cut example in my view that patents did have a negative impact on an entire industry in the UK, and that is why legislative action was taken in place.
Well, I know quite a bit about that. There was a secret. There was, yeah, David said I was around at the time. There was a secret wartime report called the Parker Report, which I happen to have a copy of somewhere, or at least my old chambers do. It's never been published, but I got it out of the patent office once. And it was all about the wicked way the Germans had been using the patent system to suppress inventions of various kinds. It never had any detail in it. And it led to the 1919 Act. And I suspect the whole of that Act was based upon pure prejudice. It wasn't a successful Act. It introduced compulsory licensing for food and medicines, which became Section 41 of the 1949 Act. It did indeed say you can only have process patents for food or medicines. And one cannot say that the period until we changed the law and allowed product patents was a particularly successfully innovative period in the field of pharmaceuticals, which is what this is all about. The truth is that, like many policy-making operations in patent law, they are decided on the basis of supposed truth rather than proper analysis, without going to the evidence. I don't think it was even true the perception of what German law was doing, because German law wasn't any more protective really than English law. The Germans used the patent system better. They still do. So my answer to your question, it is a full face-on answer, is the Act is not evidence of what the truth was. Okay, drinkies time.